So anyway, thanks for having me. Sorry for being so late and unorganized, but again, my apologies. Here, so I had a little bit of an agenda that was sent over to me by Kate. I'm going to walk through and feel free to ask any questions as you see fit. So some of the things we wanted to address: who we are, types of projects, types of loans. Oh, that's not me. Those are the questions she was asking me. So who we are. Established in '93. We take investments very simply. We mostly do what you would call CDs. We call them term notes and demand accounts. So we basically take investments and then re-lend them out to mostly UCC churches and organizations, but increasingly non-UCC and multi-faith organizations or other non-denominational borrowers. We've really seen an increase in, I would say, non-UCC churches over the past year or so. We are networking a bit more with some of the other investment funds and loan funds, and we do a lot of referrals. We are actually been getting a ton of referrals from some of the larger non-denominational extension fund lenders who typically, don't do anything below, 3 or 4 million and can only often lend to non-denominationals. Our expertise, my background is in community development. I came to the Cornerstone Fund from a CDFI and doing lots of consulting. So we have, while we typically, I think up until the point I got there, had mostly done sanctuary repairs and some food bank, a lot of repairs. Since I've joined, we've done a new market tax credit deal in Louisville, some affordable housing out in California, just a number. We're kind of getting our hands in a number of different things, solar panels. I would say since COVID, we've seen a lot of churches go back to sanctuary repair and HVAC and things like that, just because they knew that the churches would be empty. So we've done a lot of accessibility projects. We've kind of stepped back a little bit. We're starting now to see a lot more as kind of we roll out of COVID. We're getting a lot of interest from CCDAs, community Christian development agencies. So we're starting to see it uptick again into other type of lending. Just the different types of loans that we have. When I think early on, Cornerstone Fund was mostly, their big product was 5-year balloons. I think that there was a change to a 5-year adjustable rate mortgage, kind of going out 30 years, which was super well received by many of the congregations. Because it basically adjusts every 5 years. It was good for staff in the terms that you don't have to keep modifying loans. And it was good for the churches in that you could do, it was less of a struggle for them to have to redo a loan every 5 years. And it was a little more consistent. So most of our stuff has now gone to the adjustable rate loan. That's our big selling point. Do a lot of, we do a lot of acquisition loans, purchase loans, mostly construction, just a kind of a whole list of things that we do. Starting to do more of some creation care stuff as well. For a lot of the non-denominationals, we've done a lot of refinance. I don't know what you are all seeing, but across the country, we're seeing where a lot of the standard commercial banks are either not lending to churches, or they are saying, you're ballooning and we don't want to take you on again. So there's been a move from a lot of the commercial lenders to saying, we're not going to renew this. So that's typically where we're seeing a lot of our non-UCC loans come. They're mostly refinances or acquisitions. This is just to give you some stuff that I did for our board. As I was talking about, you can see where the 5-year balloon in September 17 constituted about 55% of our portfolio. To August of this year, 5%. You can see where there are, so the 5-year ARMs here basically kind of took place. So we're now over 50% on doing ARMs. And what I've spent a lot of my time doing since I've come on too is actually kind of adjusting our business model geared towards adjustable rate mortgages. A lot of the work behind the scenes is really kind of portfolio maintenance. And so what I've done on that really non-sexy side of the world is kind of, making sure that our portfolio looks good, is in good shape. So really kind of changing our structures to kind of meet that new business model. Just to give you some idea on who we're lending to, I would say that the number of loans that we approve has stayed fairly consistent across the year, but with COVID, and I think with churches just changing in general, we're seeing much smaller loans. So if you look at what we did through August of 21, this is a low amount for us. What we saw, lots of external refinances. Still, our big thing was construction and rehab. And we had a lot of loans that were on the books that we did not disperse at this time. So we had a lot more disbursements toward the end of the year. So this number went up substantially. We had a lot of people, and even more by the end of the year, coming in for audio, visual, and tech equipment to do that outreach. So it gives you some idea on what we lend to. Just to kind of give you where we're at, like I was saying, over the years, you could see we didn't have many big loans in 2020. We had some really big loans in 18 and 19. So these are skewed a little bit because we had some really big ones close. The number, and you could see we also had a lot more loans in 19. It was a very busy year. So I just wanted to go over some of the projects, kind of like what we've done that was a little different over the past year. And feel free to ask if you have any questions, what we're seeing. So Genesis Worship Center is a project that we did out in Oakland, California. This was their fellowship hall. We ended up working with them to turn it into 12 affordable. At the time when we started, it was going to be Section 8 housing. By the time we finished, it ended up being 12 units of reentry housing because they received a grant through the county to do reentry. And the pastor associated with this church has a very strong history in reentry work. So we have one more payment to pay out on this, but it was a really good project. It was very frustrating at the beginning because, and I think we probably see this with a lot of churches. They didn't know what they didn't know. So it's like, well, this is easy. We have a 2-page contract with our GC who does houses, and we're going to do this project. So it was a great learning curve for us to realize kind of like the upfront work that we need to do with some of the churches going into these type of projects. You need an AIA contract, you need a real estate attorney, you need someone to review the draws, you need to have your architect more involved. So when we went to visit them, in September to see the final product. They also did repart of their church. They're fully occupied with the reentry folks. Things are going well. And it was, we really got close once we got out of the tense period, the first 6 months when we're saying, we can't fund you unless you do this. We can't give you this unless you do this. They were very reluctant to hire a real estate attorney. They were really reluctant to go to an AIA contract. So it was a lot of hand holding. Took much longer than it should have, but ultimately it ended up being a really great project. And we would work with them again. And I would think they'd say the same about us. They would take on another project if it came their way. There's just some insides. This is the Molo Village project. This is a New Markets tax credit deal in Louisville. We were the lead lender leading up into the New Markets entity. This was a really well done project, great project team. Work with McCormick Barron, and they are fully leased. And this is next to the estates or public housing down in Louisville. So most of their tenants include our tenants that will really kind of support the neighborhood around. This one, again, this was a really great project, went fairly smoothly, even through COVID, a couple of month delays based on supplies and just workers being caught off the site because of COVID. but really turned out well. And you can see that they are fully occupied. The good table is one that we're working on now. This is a former Japanese nursery. So you could say it's August 2020, but we are actually under construction now. This is a project that's very similar to Genesis Worship Center. This was a nursery that they're turning into their worship space. They sold their church, so they have a nice endowment. They partnered with another organization called Planting Justice. So they're doing a cafe, they're doing a nursery, and it's also a reentry what they're working on. This is another one where we have kind of stopped right now and said we need to bring the architect back in. It's a lot of project for, you know, a pastor and an interior designer to handle. So we kind of need to bring you some assistance. So we've partnered them with an architect that we use for Genesis Worship Center to be an owner's rep. So we've just started that process. We feel really good about it, and hopefully we see this being done over the next 6 months. This is another thing that we're starting to see a lot of, and we think we're going to end up funding more of, is a multi-church initiative. So we're actually a participant on this. We're working with another extension. It's not a huge loan. It's about $700,000, but we wanted to participate because we kind of want this in our portfolio to use as an example for other churches. You have a Lutheran church, you have a UCC church and a Catholic church all deciding to remain separate entities, but move into one church, and the other two have sold their buildings. So we are this close to closing on this project. Again, they created a new LLC called MCI, and they've got this really intricate, you know, budget where everybody pays a little bit, and two of the congregations worship in this part and another worships in the other. But we see this being a model moving forward. We have seen that it tends to be when churches are different denominations that this seems to work a little bit better than the same denomination coming together. We have had a lot of interest in people asking us about this and have identified a number of consultants across the country that are starting to kind of work with different churches as they figure out how to live their mission, not necessarily in their original building. This is a project that we're working on. Again, it's another participation with the Episcopalians. So we're doing a solar panel project where we're using tax credits out of Newark, and we're working with the Diocese of Newark. We're looking at doing this ourselves with some UCC churches. And let's see, you can just have a couple of different models of how it works. This will be about a $2 million. Actually, it's gone up a little bit. We're about $2 million in this loan, and we're kind of working through the legal documents right now. I expect this to close. We see ourselves doing more of this type of development with New Jersey, and I think we're looking at Virginia as well in the near future. And Manhattan Bible, which some of you probably recognize, we did a $50,000 unsecured pre-development, which we typically don't do for a non-UCC church. So this was different for us, but we wanted to we work with Jason on this to see, this is an exciting project to see happen. As we wait for the $1 million construction loan and the whole process to go through the New York Attorney General process, we look forward to seeing that happen as well. But this was something that I shared with our board because obviously they had to approve it. And they are very excited to see what comes out of this. Just to give you a little bit more of how we underwrite, I think that was one of the things that Kate asked me to speak to. This is kind of what we look at when we're underwriting. And when we send out an application, we look at basically 3 years financials, investment statements, bank statements, kind of like how many members you have, what the value of the church is, a lot of different things. And it really comes down to this type of analysis. So we start saying, what does the loan to value look like? What's the debt per member? Kind of gives us a guide. And we've always used this, as far as I understand, this has gone up a little bit, but the $3,000 per member is kind of a guide to say, if this loan were to explode, how much could you get from each member? How much would each member be willing to come up with to make us whole? And I think that's kind of the guide. Coming from a non-church world, this was a different way to understand underwriting. You use some of the same criteria in terms of like, debt service coverage ratio, things like that. But some of the other things that you measure were definitely a bit different for me. So this is just one that I had done a risk rating on. And I just decided to share it with you, where we look at the capital campaign, if they have one, if they have reserves, if for some reason something like COVID were to happen, how much do they have in reserves to make their payments, things like that. So it just gives you some idea on what our underwriting looks like. So we, as part of the portfolio thing that I mentioned before, we started a risk rating system. It's really underwriting our existing portfolio, just trying to understand, where our risks are, what kind of trends we're seeing as churches, as things change in the church world. So just to kind of give you some idea of what we get updated financials every year. We review the collateral. We kind of review where they are on a every 3 year basis, every year basis for some larger loans, and then we grade them. This is kind of what the grading scale looks like. So each year we're going to look like their debt per member, their debt service coverage ratio, is their collateral still good? Have they had any delinquencies? We're seeing one of the things that we see a lot of is declining membership. So a church that we may have lent to back in 2005 may look very different than a church we're lending to in 2022. So we definitely, that was one of the things that was a surprise to me as I went back and started looking at portfolios, is that, we lent to a church based on their very strong membership, but that membership may have changed drastically in 20 years. So we kind of go back and reevaluate that. And just a little bit more of the risk rating, what things look like, and how we come up with a reserve for our financials. Financial assessments is something that Kate asked me to talk about, and this is something that we developed as more of an outreach effort to certain churches. Again, it's kind of a preliminary form of underwriting. We look at churches and say, if you send us your financials and you tell us what your goals are and you tell us how you're investing, we can give you some idea on how what you may want to think about in the future, or this is, some areas you might want to pay more attention to, and this is how you compare to other churches with, other Protestant churches or the UCC. So I did one on Church X here. You could see where we just did an analysis of where they were in 2018, where they are in 19, where they are in 20. And we broke this down by their expenses, down by personnel, building occupancy, worship program, mission, and outside giving. We broke these down because we wanted something to compare it to. And the Lake Institute has done some really nice work on how churches, where the money comes from for churches and how they spend their money. And so we tried to do that across looking at UCC and mainline Protestant churches. So this is one of the ones we did for Church X. And we also have something called the Data Hub, which is for UCC churches only. And we try to compare it to Data Hub as well as the Lake Institute. So we looked at their income, how does it compare to other UCC churches on average, and Lake Congregational, most of their work is done by median. So it's something else to compare it to, but not exactly apples to apples. Also, just to kind of give a church, where do you compare pledges per member, 613 for an average church. So this church did really well, but their expense per member was much higher than, say, a Data Hub average. And then we get down to comparing where, how churches fare against other pledges and offerings. This church did really well. They took a lot of their income from building use and rental. They actually rented to a Montessori school. And so what we look at there, so that's great, right? So there's less pressure. What we look at more closely is their building occupancy was only 16% compared to most other churches who spend about 24% of their expenses are spent kind of maintaining the building. So this always leads us to say, hey, are you spending enough? Is there deferred maintenance you want to take a look at? things like that. So it's just kind of a guideline. Some of the other things we look at is this church was really not reaching out well into the community. And they kind of acknowledged that, but just weren't quite sure where to go. And you can see that their fundraising, is at 1%, right? Compared to typical, what we see is around 6 or higher. Let's see what else. The other thing too is that a lot of times if you put worship and mission together, here is about 22%. These guys are at 14. They weren't doing a lot of mission outreach. It was just kind of, business as usual. They know they wanted to do more. They needed to do more in terms of outreaching in the community, but weren't quite sure where to go. So it's not like a book on how to move forward, but does highlight some points that as church leadership, you want to take a look at when you're only spending 1% of your 1% of your expenses is for mission and service and outreach. You probably want to take a look at what you're doing. And then this is just an assessment of their financials. And again, we kind of spread them out and say, oh, look, you've got so much money in a money market. You might want to put that in something that's going to pay you a little bit more because, you're only on your zero balance budget. You're only, you don't need to take that much out of your savings each year. So to have all of that in cash seems a bit, you could probably get more investment somewhere in a better vehicle. And then we also kind of compare them where they are in terms of demographics. So here's just an indication. We look at, they have the, is it a baby boomer? You have growing families, that type of thing. And we also take a look at to say, you're a Protestant church in an area where you're seeing a big decline in mainline Protestant denominations. Are you working with the other churches? How does this, fit into your strategy? What we're seeing is either a big increase, right, in the no preference or non-denominational churches in your area, seeing a decline in more of the Catholic and mainline Protestants, specifically, in UCC, there was a nice decline. They were actually a very small part of this mainline Protestant denomination. So, given this information, how do you think you'll move forward? So just kind of getting to the end, what do we see is in store for 2022? We've been doing webinars in terms of outreach, getting a lot of people involved. We just did a use of space webinar 2 weeks ago, had a great response to that. Folks trying to figure out how we, if I'm going to rent my church, how do I do it? What are the pros? What are the cons? That's actually posted on our website now as a PDF. We have one in March we're looking at doing. Again, we had a lot of interest in folks who want to increase their technology or their audiovisual capabilities. A lot of interest in solar and the multi-church initiatives. We're looking at how we are impacting by state. For example, New York, we have not done a lot in New York as much as in terms of the UCC presence. Of what we have lent to is far below where we think we should be. That could be because of the New York Attorney General process. It could be because we haven't done a lot of outreach there. It could be because of the, we need to interact more with the conference. We're not sure, but we're starting to take a look at our market saturation. We're doing more outreach to multi-church initiatives and multi-faith organizations. We're finding that a lot of like Planting Justice, very young millennial-led nonprofit, kind of partnering with the church, providing some definite energy to do something different, and we're starting to see more of that. And also, we're trying to figure out how we provide more technical assistance. Right now, we are a lender. We do provide a lot of technical assistance, but we also have to look at lender liability. What can we say? What can we do? Do we need to do a different arm of? Do we need to do a spinoff in terms of trying to prepare more churches or multi-faith organizations to kind of prepare for a project? Because we feel like we've done a lot of that with the projects we've done over the past 2 years, and so we see the need. And that's all I have. So any questions?
Thank you so much. That was very rich and worth waiting for.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really sorry about the difficulties we had at the beginning. Patrick Dugan had to jump, but wanted me to make this note, which says that UCC has 2 church building lenders, the Church Building and Loan Fund, which he runs, which founded Cornerstone in 1989 to serve older UCC congregations when the Church Building and Loan Fund mission was to focus solely on newer churches. The funds are separate organizations that sometimes work together.
That is true.
So our next presenter has arrived, but I just want to make space for a couple of questions if anyone had them, and we can also continue these, in the chat as we as we move on. Beverly Dempsey wanted to know if Cornerstone funds startup projects.
I'm sorry?
Do you fund startup projects or startup congregations? Is that what you mean? Beverly, you can come off mute and ask.
Yeah, I think about, so yeah, I'm curious to know whether Cornerstone would ever have the capacity to fund something that isn't an established program. So a new church development or an unusual new church opportunity, something that wasn't mainstream and traditional, but so wouldn't benefit from a traditional source of funds.
I think so. I think we'd be open to it. For us, it's really for us and our board and our history, it's really about being able to be secured. So we've done a lot more with, and I think we'd be open to, like, typically it's that standard typical real estate, mortgage. What we've also started doing and have been very successful over the past couple of years was also securing investments. So you also can do like linked funds, things like that. So I think we're open to most things, but for us, it's really trying to figure out how we stay secured because we do have investors that we're responding to. So,
Sure.
but we have looked at, kind of dabbling in social impact or socially responsible lending, things like that. So we're open to a lot. It's just, we'd have to kind of work through the mechanics.
Okay, so work on the business plan and we'll see from there. Okay, thank you.
And it looks like we have a question from Peter.
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation. It's just so invigorating to see the work you're doing. So my question is that you're trying to get a little more of a footprint here in New York. This is a pretty complicated place, as I think you're discovering. I think what I was intrigued by your thought about giving congregations more pre-technical help, and whether you might need to do like a spin-off or something along those lines to do that. That makes a lot of sense to us as the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, to provide that kind of pre-development help. Just curious if we could talk further with you about how you could intersect with that process.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still, we're still thinking about it. And I think we just need to, we kind of need to make the time to really, we're going into a strategic planning process. And I think that's going to be part of it is how to do that, because we know it's coming. We just have to figure out how we do it. Because I think that's what we're seeing. I think people think, well, we get an application in and we, and then we're done, we approve it. But we feel that the handholding, even in a typical church project, the handholding that we have to do, like, do you have this bid? On this invoice, can they show you how much they still have left? So just kind of basic stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That we spend a tremendous amount of time because, so many volunteers, right? We're working with really dedicated volunteers of these churches, typically not paid professionals.
Right.
And so we do spend a lot of time, and as we get into more complicated projects, I think that it just takes it up a notch. And so we do need to provide that assistance.
So Bricks and Mortals and the Collaborative kind of specialize in that space of helping congregations get to the point where they know how to talk to you and get working all through all their capacity issues, that we find if those don't get attended to, they're not really able to avail themselves of these services. So
Thank you, Peter. I want to be mindful of time, and I see Taylor has a question as well, and then we'll move on to our next speaker after this question.
Thanks. If we're in a rush, I'll skip the question and just say that the reason we were so excited to have Janine here is that, as Peter said, as an organization, we are laser focused on process rather than outcome. And all of the examples that Janine gave of the things that congregations needed to do in order to get the ducks in a row, in order to talk to her, to get the support they needed to do the things they wanted to do, I think was really, really valuable. And I'll pop the question in the chat, and if we have time later, it'd be great to come back to it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much, Janine, for giving that really, really helpful presentation. And I want to encourage people to ask any follow-up questions in the chat, just in the interest of time, so we can get a presentation from Councilmember Marte's office, from Renee. Hello, I see your face now. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us to talk more about discretionary funding, which is open now and closes very soon. And with that, I will hand it off to you.
Yes, ma'am. So thank you all for having me. My name is Renee Castellanos. I am the budget director for Councilmember Christopher Marte. And she's right. The portal for discretionary funding ends February 22nd, which is a little bit under 2 weeks. And I'm going to have a presentation up on the screen. I don't know if I have permission to share the screen, but let me go ahead and try.
Yeah, you should have permission.
Thank you, Kevin. Yep, it is popping up right here. So discretionary funding is notoriously that is the wrong presentation. Let me change that. But discretionary funding is notoriously complicated, especially for, especially for religious organizations. And just because of the manner of everything with city council funding, obviously you try to have a project that is public facing more than anything else. But just to go over it a little bit, and I will describe how religious organizations fit into the process. This is the presentation that they use for general trainings at the finance division at the city council. But this is for fiscal year 2023. And if any of your organizations have gone through the sort of process in the last 2 fiscal years, it should be relatively similar. There shouldn't be any sort of differences. But to get started, what is discretionary funding? So in the simplest terms, discretionary funding is a sum of money appropriated to each council member and or caucuses or delegations within the city's expense budget allocated to eligible not-for-profit organizations. Eligible in the sense that, of course, if you're a for-profit organization, you cannot receive this funding. And there are also some other sort of criteria that we'll get into it. And an important note is that discretionary funding is reimbursement based. So it's not like the city council will just give you the money up front. Each organization has to have the ability to sort of use the money up front and then get reimbursed by it from the specific agency that is allocating these funds. Next, let's see. Oops. Who is eligible for discretionary funding? So like I said before, discretionary funds may only be allocated to not-for-profit community-based service providers. In order to receive these funds, an organization has to be incorporated as a non-for-profit within it and has its own and must have its own employer identification number, which is an IN number given by the IRS and has to be registered with the New York State Attorney General's Charities Bureau, unless it is exempt. And if you're exempt, you probably already know that you are. But if you need to know more, there's a link on the screen that I can provide later that can give you more information about that. But those are the two big sort of requirements for each organization to be eligible for discretionary funds, that it has to be registered as and incorporated as a non-for-profit, has its own EIN number, and has to be registered with the New York State Attorney General's Charities Bureau. So those two requirements are very big, and if you don't fit in those requirements, you're not eligible to get discretionary funding. Religious or affiliated organizations, and this is what is most important in this call, are eligible. A lot of people think that because they are religious, they're not eligible. That is not true. In general, these sort of funding sources are allocated for projects that are public purpose driven. So to describe that, a public purpose is defined as an activity or service that is open to all members of the public. Religious organizations must prove that this project or the project they want to fund, the program or whatever, is open to all members and does not specifically promote the religion in its sort of programming. Of course, you know, there is a sort of murky sort of line here. You know, I was raised Christian, right? And so I was taught that all my actions were sort of promoting the religion, promoting the love of God. However, it's not like I could be funded, right, and explicitly say in that program, like, hey, like, see, I'm going to give you this service, or I'm going to provide you this service, but you must come to an event, another event, like a particularly religious event. So, you know, of course, you have to kind of curtail it to being as public facing as possible. And this applies to all sort of religious affiliated organizations. We want to make sure that the funds given by city council members are, you know, as open as possible for everyone as possible. Yeah, so going forward, again, can apply. For-profit entities may not receive discretionary funds. This would be a huge breach of sort of, you know, what we're trying to do at the city council. And so how to apply for discretionary funding. Applications are submitted online. So, I know some people are kind of used to way back when we did paper sort of applications, but, you know, thank God all of this is online now. It's much more simple. The release date was, of course, January 3rd. And like I said before, it's due at 11:59 on February 22nd, 2022. This is the due date that we require everyone to submit everything for. And if you do not get this in by that date, unfortunately, the portal is closed and there's no sort of way that I know of to get the application in the system. And if it's, you know, let's say it's 11:59 and you're coming down to it and there's a technical issue with the computer, always reach out to your council person to see if there's some sort of way that you can do this. But to my understanding, that due date is concrete. So please get your applications in on time. In fiscal year 2023, they've added the option allowing the applicants to either start a new application or to access an in progress or submitted applications. To my understanding, if you start one and then you leave it there and save it, you can, you know, go back on the city council website to access it. But it's my recommendation just to go at it at one go, so you don't forget any sort of passwords, you don't forget any sort of things in the process. But yeah, there's a link. And again, I will provide this presentation. I'll provide the link after the call as well. There are several different types of discretionary funding in this sort of expense process. And this kind of can get a little bit convoluted, but just to explain very simply, the member items or member discretionary for each council member, there are 51 council members in the city. Each one is designated 4 pots, what we call them. There is a type of funding called local funding or local initiative. This is your general sort of funding source for any sort of program that the council member wants to apply. So there's not some sort of, you know, unique criteria that you have to pertain to. There is youth programming. So, you know, programming that is particularly denoted for youth programs. Think after-school programs, daycare centers, programs around educating the youth, things like that. And similarly, there's an aging pot. So this is for the members of the elderly, anything that is trying to help them out, any sort of programs that are educating them as well. So it's kind of like youth, just for another age-specific, group of people. And then lastly, there's anti-poverty. And this is, of course, any sort of initiative by an organization that is attempting to help curtail the sort of the effects of low income status. Next, there is what we call speaker funding. And so obviously, the speaker of the city council has a lot more discretion with the funding that we receive. And so these are for projects that cost a lot more than normal expense projects. Every council member has a allocation, correct? And so there's a finite amount of organizations that we can fund. If your project is, high in value, if it costs a lot of money, we can, if you meet with us, we can, suggest to the speaker to fund that project as a part of their discretionary portion. So this is a little bit of a higher level kind of thing. But once you are meeting with your council members, there is a potential for being allocated the speaker funding or being nominated to receive that speaker funding. Next, and this is probably the second most important one for your organizations, are member designated initiatives. And these are specific initiatives or programs allocated after budget adoption, which is later in the year around the middle of summer, with a specific purpose and guidelines that are equally split and designated by each council member. So if you have organizations that, for example, strive to, plant trees and create sort of environmental consciousness, that might qualify for a Greener NYC grant. Food pantries have their own grant as well. There are sort of other things like CASA grant, which is particularly curtailed for after school programming for kids. And I can give a PDF that has a little bit more information about these member designated initiatives, but this is also something that you would apply for on the portal. Citywide initiatives, of course, it's sort of the similar thing. These are initiatives created to address different needs across the city that the aforementioned pots of funding might not readily address. And these sort of initiatives, you would meet with specific committees and be sponsored by specific council members. And again, if you reach out to your council member's office, they will, walk you through this process and give you the context that you need. And then lastly, borough-wide initiative. This is funding that is designated by a borough delegation. My council member, Christopher Marte, is the chair or co-chair of the Manhattan delegation. And so I know from our end, the process for applying through the delegation isn't decided yet. I'm not sure if this is the same for the Bronx, Queens, or Staten Island, but I reckon that we'll get a little bit more information as the weeks come along. Going forward, what is the vetting process? So this is a little bit more convoluted, but it is essentially seeing if an organization is in fact in qualification with those two qualities that we're looking for. One, does the organization have an employer identification number from the IRS? And two, is it registered with the Charities Bureau? There are several forms that you're going to be filling out on the application process. There's an authorization form, very simple to fill out, though it must be notarized, and it can be notarized and signed electronically. There's a conflict of interest form that you might need to fill out if, for example, I went to one of your churches or was a participant in one of those programs, which I don't think applies right here. There's an affiliation form as well that's a little bit similar. And these will come much more clear when you go through the application. Two sort of important notes here. Newly created organizations, which I'm not sure applies here, but organizations that have been incorporated within the last 2 fiscal years may not receive funding in excess of 20,000 total and no more than 10,000 per single member. New to the council, organizations that have not received funding in the past 3 fiscal years from the city council may not receive funding in excess of 50,000 total and no more than 25 from a single member. And so these two bullet points are important to write down. And of course, when you look through the presentation, I wish they would have bolded it, because a lot of organizations come to us asking for, let's say $60,000 or like 30,000 from me and then 30,000 from another council member. And we have to sadly say, no, we have to alter those numbers because you're either new or you're new to the council. And so if you are new to the council or a newer organization, just please keep that in mind so you can save yourself some time and not have to like meet with different organizations or meet with different council members just to hear no or something like that. Again, compliance with the Attorney General's Charities Bureau, super important. And also in the vetting process, of course, the review of an organization's past agency evaluations. One thing with the pandemic that we're looking for is the ability for an organization to switch from virtual to in-person programming at a moment's notice. Something that happened a lot in the last couple fiscal years was that organizations were actually left money on the table. Their reimbursement allocations were not able to be used all the way because they had to switch, unfortunately, from in-person to virtual programming, which sometimes cost a little bit less. And so, you know, even with new organizations, we look for organizations that are very flexible in terms of their funding source, in the sense that we look that they can actually use those funds. Furthermore, you know, of course, we vet on news articles, social media, the internet. We want to make sure that these organizations are, you know, in at least on face value, actually, you know, living out the values that they profess to do. You know, this is an important thing. Think of it as a sort of like, if you're applying for a job, right, you obviously want to have a social media presence that isn't sort of looking bad on your employer. In this sense, you know, we want to, you know, give and help out organizations that, you know, make New York City, you know, the best city that it can be, so that more people can come over here and participate and enjoy the city. Going forward, this is sort of a little bit more technical than the rest, but one of the aspects of the application, and this is how we sort of see how the organizations might be, you know, qualified or not, is the passport system. And so this helps organizations be trained in sort of the allotment of funds, and it explains the process a little bit more thoroughly. This is a link that you will have at the end of the conversation, or at the end of the presentation, and at the resources that I'm going to provide. But this is how they sort of allot the different contracts and just set up everything with your organization. And just to note, a capacity building training is required for CBOs or organizations receiving more than $10,000. So if you do receive more than $10,000 in terms of your reimbursement, you're required to get this sort of training, which is very important. And a very important note that a lot of people miss is that this training is tied to one particular person. So let's say a member of your organization, let's say the president or the CEO or whoever it may be, did this training. If they were to leave that training would leave with them. And so let's say they left, you would have to allocate, or you would have to designate that another person to have that training. And the training is good for 3 years. So, you know, after 3 years, things might change. You might want to do the training again because that is going to make you eligible yet again for more than $10,000. When will an organization receive their funding? So just to explain, number one, an organization submits their discretionary application to the council. This is everything that I was talking about before. Then the organization creates an account and is registered with the passport system, the sort of pre-qualifying system that I just mentioned on the last slide. The city council then designates an award to the organization in Schedule C. And Schedule C is a document used by city council to sort of denote all of the designations of money, all of the allocations given through that fiscal year. The fiscal year goes through July to June. And so in June, we release Schedule C, and that's where you will see your organization receiving money and whatnot. After that, City Council and the Mayor's Office of Contracting Services perform their review/vetting process and clear the award. After they clear the designation, a list of all clear awards is sent out to the city agencies and comptrollers, and the comptroller. And after this point, this is when you will start seeing the contracts given to each organization. And the rest of the bullet points aren't super important to go over right now, but just to kind of summarize, after that point in which they're all cleared, more sort of correspondence between you and the Mayor's Office of Contracting Services, as well as the agencies, will happen to discuss how exactly the funds will be allocated. And this is just a sort of flow chart of the previously described process of the contracting. And that is pretty much it for the presentation. Again, I'm going to share all of the resources given to me from Finance Division and this presentation as well. And of course, I will, for those organizations in my district, I will drop down my email. For anyone else outside of District 1, I would heavily suggest to go ahead and to contact your council member, because everyone has different sort of processes. Some offices, I know our office has a supplemental form, which is a PDF just describing the different programs that everyone has. In addition, other offices might have that as well, or different processes altogether. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to questions. Again, most of the questions, if I can answer them, I will try to. If not, I can go and reach out to the City Council Finance Division and get back to you as soon as possible. Let's see.
Are there any questions? I had a quick question. You
Yeah,
said
go
for
ahead.
the member initiatives, they're awarded later in the summer. Is that after this first Schedule C is released in June?
Yes, so y'all will receive a lot more information about these as the time comes, but essentially member designated initiatives, the purpose is to sort of fill in the gaps that the regular funding was not able to sort of fill in. These are more specific programs. Like, for example, there's one around a immigrant, it's called Cultural Immigrant Initiative, that goes out to educate people and help immigrants out with a variety of different educational programs. So a lot of organizations like to apply for that. This comes out after adoption, so around July, August, and that's when members can go ahead and designate certain organizations for those funds. And of course, you apply for them during this application process. So if your organization wants to apply for one of those, if they have a program that they think would apply for one of these member designated initiatives, go ahead and you can, there's a space in the application where you can say, I want to receive this program, or I want to apply for this program, so that in July or in August, when we're reviewing, we can meet with that organization and investigate a little bit further and see if we can designate it into what is called a transparency resolution, which is essentially another resolution passed to edit the Schedule C that was passed in July. So throughout the year, people are, the City Council is editing the budget. And so those member designated initiatives happen later into the fiscal year.
All right, great. That's really helpful.
Mhm.
All right, were there any final questions?
Thank you.
Just quickly, is there in the future another round, like in a couple of years, like if you miss this deadline?
So the discretionary funding happens every year. So it is opened up in January and it ends in February. But throughout the year, you can always have sort of meetings with your city council person to discuss funding requests for the next year. But it happens every year. There's not to worry, like it's not like it's never going to happen until like 4 years from now. So you have, it's like clockwork, to be honest.
Okay.
And throughout the year, there are other sort of programs that you can apply for, like the member designated initiative. But, I would suggest you lose nothing if you apply, just go ahead and put your application in there. If you don't get it, unfortunately you don't get it, but it's good to show consistency, and you never know, you might actually receive the money. One thing I will say is that this year is special because a lot of council people are new. And so a lot of them are going to want to change their allocations. Some organizations are sort of, they're sort of scared to apply because the general consensus is that council members will continue to fund the same organizations year after year. But because people are new, including my own council member, a lot of times we want to change the direction that funding goes to. Makes it more equitable. You know, we disagree with something from the previous administration. So it's always important to apply, I think. And yeah, like you said, I mean, or like you were talking about, happens every year.
All right, great. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know our group has dwindled a little bit, but we're going to provide this as a recording, and we'll also send out your PowerPoint to everyone. So the full group and more will receive this as a really, really helpful resource. I know you jumped from another meeting to this one, so thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
All right, great. So with that, we'll close the meeting.
Thanks, everybody. Motion to close. Are there any members left? Peter, you want a second?
Second, yeah.
There you go.
Thanks so
All
much.
right.
Guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.